The skies above Earth had turned a deep, ominous red as the alien ships hovered like dark, menacing clouds. Kara Thale, commander of the Kithari, stood at the head of the invasion force, her sharp, silver eyes scanning the battered city below. Earth was to be just another conquest in her long, storied campaign across the galaxy, and her mission was clear: wipe out humanity, claim the planet, and add it to the ever-expanding Kithari Empire. She had fought countless wars, destroyed entire civilizations, and never once faltered in her duty. To Kara, humans were nothing more than a nuisance, weak, disorganized, and barely worthy of the resources they clung to. But this time, something was different. As her drop ship descended, the first signs of human resistance began to stir, and Kara's instincts tingled. They weren't retreating in fear. No, they were preparing for a fight. The ramp of the ship lowered with a metallic hiss, and Kara stepped onto the charred earth, her boots sinking into the rubble. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. Around her, Kithari soldiers readied themselves, weapons raised and eyes cold with the certainty of victory. Yet as they moved forward, something about the humans' movements caught her attention. They weren't the panicked, defeated soldiers Kara had expected. They fought like cornered animals, desperate and unpredictable, but there was an undeniable fire in their hearts. These weren't the easy kills she was used to. These humans, they were fighting for more than just survival. There was something else driving them, something Kara couldn't quite place. As Kara advanced, leading her troops toward the heart of the city, she saw them. A small group of humans had set up a barricade, armed with what seemed like nothing more than scraps of metal and makeshift rifles. Yet they fought with incredible ferocity, using their environment to outmaneuver the Kithari soldiers. It was chaos, unpredictable and wild, but it was working. They had no advanced weaponry, no shields or plasma cannons, yet they were holding their ground. Kara's soldiers faltered, their precision disrupted by the humans' guerrilla tactics. It was clear, these humans were resourceful. They weren't the weak, primitive creatures Kara had believed them to be. They were fighting with everything they had, and they weren't going down without a fight. Suddenly, a human soldier appeared on top of a shattered building, his torn uniform fluttering in the wind. He was no more than a shadow against the crimson sky, but Kara could see his face, smudged with dirt and blood. His eyes were alive, burning with something Kara had never seen before. Defiance. His voice rang out across the battlefield, cutting through the chaos. You think we're just going to roll over for you? Come down here and find out what we're made of. For a moment, Kara hesitated. His challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at her feet. This human, this soldier, wasn't like the others. He was different. His gaze locked with hers, and in that instant, she felt something stir deep within her, a flicker of doubt. This wasn't just a battle. This was something more. But there was no time for second thoughts. Kara motioned for her soldiers to advance, her mind pushing the moment aside. The mission had to come first. But then it happened. The ground beneath her feet erupted in a deafening explosion. Kara's world turned to chaos as she was thrown into the air, the blast knocking the wind out of her. Her combat suit struggled to compensate, its systems flickering, and pain shot through her side. She landed hard, the impact taking the breath from her lungs. Dizzy, disoriented, she tried to rise, but her body refused to cooperate. She saw the faces of her soldiers rushing toward her, but something was wrong. Their weapons weren't aimed at the humans. They were pointed at her. High Command sends its regards, Commander, came a voice she never expected to hear, Acker, her second-in-command. His tone was cold, emotionless. Betrayal. Before Kara could process what was happening, a plasma bolt ripped through her side, and she crumpled to the ground. The world around her faded to black, and everything went silent. When Kara's eyes finally fluttered open, the world felt alien. She was no longer on the battlefield. She wasn't even sure where she was. The room around her was dimly lit, and the air was stale, thick with the hum of machinery. She tried to move but winced in pain. Her combat suit was barely functional now, its once glowing patterns reduced to weak, flickering pulses. She looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. "You're awake," a voice said, soft yet confident. Kara's gaze snapped to the source. There, sitting on the floor nearby, was the human soldier. The same one who had shouted at her before. The same one who had saved her. His uniform was singed, his face streaked with exhaustion, but there was no mistaking the resolve in his eyes. He was working on something, a damaged generator, but when he looked up at her, there was no sign of hostility, no smirk of victory. Just a calm, steady gaze. "Why?" Kara whispered, her voice barely more than a rasp. "Why didn't you leave me to die?" The soldier paused, setting down his tools, his expression unreadable. "Because I couldn't just leave you there," he said, his voice simple, matter-of-fact. "Not all of us are heartless." The words hung in the air, strange and foreign to Kara. She had been trained to see humans as weak, inferior, expendable. Yet this man had risked his life to save hers. It didn't make sense. Kara narrowed her eyes, forcing herself to sit up despite the pain in her side. "What's your name?" she demanded. The soldier didn't flinch, a slight smirk curling at the corner of his lips. "Lieutenant Sam Carter." "And you are?" Kara hesitated for a moment. To reveal her identity, to expose her weakness, felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught. But something in Sam's gaze made her hesitate. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure who the enemy was anymore. "Lyra Thale," she said finally. "Well, Lyra," Sam said, his voice a bit warmer now. "Welcome to the Resistance." Kara's mind was racing. Resistance? She was no longer the invader. She was a prisoner, and the very humans she had sought to destroy were the ones who had saved her. She had come here to fight them, to conquer them, and now she was bound to them. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. But one thing was certain, her world had just been turned upside down, and the man before her, this human, was the only one who could help her make sense of it all. The air was thick with the hum of machinery, and the low growl of distant explosions reverberated through the walls of the hidden base. Lyra, still wincing from the damage to her side, shifted uneasily against the metal wall, her eyes never leaving the human soldier, Sam Carter. The tension between them was palpable, but so was the strange, unspoken understanding that had begun to grow. Sam was busy at work, tinkering with pieces of salvaged tech, broken rifles, damaged equipment, and a hodgepodge of old, repurposed machinery. It was a far cry from the precision and perfection she was used to back home. "You should rest," Sam said, glancing up from his work, his voice calm but firm. He wiped sweat from his brow, clearly exhausted from the hours of repair work. "You're still in bad shape." "I don't have time to rest," Lyra muttered through gritted teeth. "I'm not here to lie down and recover." She shifted again, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in her side. The way he said it, the softness in his tone, it was almost as if he cared. It was foreign to her, and she hated it. Sam raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Suit yourself," he said, picking up a piece of a broken energy weapon and starting to fix it. "But if you're gonna keep pushing yourself, you're gonna bleed out on me." The words hit harder than expected, and Lyra tightened her jaw, determined not to show any sign of weakness. The last thing she needed was for him to think she was vulnerable. Despite his apparent concern, he was still human, a species she had sworn to eradicate, and who now seemed to be saving her life. Her mind whirled, trying to make sense of everything. The Kithari, her people, had betrayed her. The attack had been swift, brutal, and calculated, everything she'd ever known had shattered in an instant. The alliance she had believed in, the cause she had fought for, was now meaningless. Akker's betrayal cut deep, and worse still, she had no idea why it happened. High Command had thrown her away, left her to die in the dirt like an expendable piece of cargo. The realization gnawed at her, a raw, bitter wound that no one could heal, not even Sam Carter, the very human she had been sent to destroy. "How long has this resistance of yours been around?" she asked, her voice low, careful. She didn't want to admit it, but she was curious. Curious about them. Curious about him. Sam paused, his hands stilling for a moment before he replied. "A few years. Started small. We were just a handful of survivors at first. But we've grown. We've had to adapt, learn how to fight back. We've got our methods." "Methods?" Lyra scoffed, eyes narrowing. "You're fighting with scraps. I've seen your weapons, they're nothing more than junk, cobbled together." Sam chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Scraps, maybe. But it works. I think you'd be surprised at what we can do with a little ingenuity." He looked up at her then, his expression serious. "You Kithari, you think you've got all the advantages. You've got your fancy suits, your high-tech weapons, your so-called superiority. But in the end, it's not about how advanced your technology is. It's about will. Will." The word hung in the air, strange and heavy. For the first time, Lyra questioned her entire perspective. She had never considered the will of humanity. To her, humans were weak, driven only by survival instincts, nothing more than a nuisance to be eradicated. But Sam's words were like a crack in her armor, exposing something she hadn't allowed herself to see. Sam stood, wiping his hands on his pants as he walked over to her. "Look," he said, sitting down beside her. "You're not the only one who's been betrayed. You're not the only one who's lost everything." Lyra stiffened, but Sam continued before she could snap back. "When this war started, we had nothing. We were just civilians, caught in the middle of an invasion, with no clue how to fight back. But we adapted. We learned. And now, we fight not just for survival, but for our future." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that surprised her. "And you're gonna help us, whether you like it or not." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. "Help you? I've been sent here to destroy you. I'm not going to help you." Sam sighed, clearly exhausted by the whole conversation. "You don't have to like it. But we're in this together now. You're stuck here, your suit's barely functional, and your people aren't exactly coming to rescue you. So for now, we do things my way." For a moment, the words hung between them like a challenge. Lyra wanted to fight it, to deny it. But she couldn't. Not in this moment. Not when she was this vulnerable. She clenched her fists, frustration boiling inside her. "So, what's your plan, Lieutenant?" she asked, her voice cold, controlled. "You've got no army, no weapons, and no backup. What do you think you can do?" Sam looked at her, his face betraying none of the weariness that had taken root in his voice. "We've got one thing you don't, resilience. You'd be surprised at how far that can take you." Resilience. The word echoed in Lyra's mind. It was something she had never fully understood about humanity. They didn't have the advanced technology the Kithari had, nor the strength or speed that Lyra's kind was known for. But they had this relentless drive to survive, to adapt, to overcome. It wasn't something that could be measured by weapons or suits. It was something deeper, something that defied logic and reason. "All right," Lyra said finally, her voice softer than before. "I'll help. For now. But don't mistake this for alliance. I'm still Kithari. I'm still your enemy." Sam nodded, his expression unreadable. "I get it. But right now, we're on the same side. Just remember, you're not the only one who can change." Lyra said nothing, but inside, a flicker of doubt began to take root. What if Sam was right? What if, in the end, it wasn't about which side was stronger, but which side had the heart to keep fighting? Hours passed, and the makeshift shelter buzzed with activity. Sam worked tirelessly to improve the defenses, while Lyra began to repair her suit. The organic armor, once sleek and near invincible, was now a shattered mess. But with Sam's help, and a bit of ingenuity, she began to see it could be salvaged. It would never be the same, but it would function. And perhaps that was the first step toward something new. Lyra glanced at Sam, who was tinkering with the last of the old tech, his focus unwavering. For a brief moment, she wondered if he was right. Perhaps she had underestimated humanity's will to survive. And perhaps, just perhaps, this human, this soldier who had saved her life, wasn't just the enemy she had once believed him to be. The quiet was broken only by the occasional hum of the generator and the soft clinking of metal tools. Lyra sat against the wall, her back pressed against the cold, hard surface of the maintenance bay. The pain in her side had subsided somewhat, but it still throbbed with every breath. She glanced at Sam, who was hunched over a pile of broken machinery, his hands working quickly and efficiently despite the exhaustion etched into his features. "How long do you think we'll be stuck here?" she asked, her voice betraying the frustration she felt. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the uncertainty of everything. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what the next step would be. She had always been the one in control, always leading her soldiers, always knowing exactly what needed to be done. But now, she was adrift. Sam didn't look up from his work as he answered. "Could be a while. Unless you've got a secret escape plan, we're pretty much stuck here until we figure out our next move." Lyra clenched her fists, staring at the floor. "I don't do stuck." Sam's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was something else behind his eyes, something thoughtful, something that made Lyra pause. "You should. Sometimes, stuck is where the best ideas come from." She wasn't sure if he meant it as a challenge or just as an observation, but it hit her like a quiet revelation. What if he was right? What if being stuck, being out of control, was the very thing that could spark new possibilities? For the first time, Lyra allowed herself to consider the idea, however reluctantly. As the day wore on, the tension between them seemed to ease, but only slightly. There was still the unspoken understanding that they were enemies, that they had fought on opposite sides of a war that had cost them both dearly. But there was also a strange kind of camaraderie that was forming, one that neither of them had expected. It wasn't friendship, not yet. But it was something else, something that had the potential to change everything. Sam finally straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. "All right, this should hold for now." He glanced at her, eyes narrowing in thought. "You're not exactly in a position to fight, but you can help me with something." Lyra didn't respond immediately. She was still grappling with the idea that, despite everything, she was beginning to rely on him. She had no choice, not if she wanted to survive. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice cool and controlled. Sam grabbed a piece of scrap metal from the pile and tossed it into her lap. "I need you to help me reinforce the front door. It won't hold if the Kithari come looking for you. And trust me, they will." Lyra studied the scrap metal for a moment before standing with a fluid motion, despite the lingering ache in her side. "I thought you said you didn't have the right tools to fight back." "We don't," Sam said, his tone serious. "But we've got enough to make it harder for them to get through. Sometimes, that's all you need." His words again struck a chord with her. She couldn't help but think about the difference between them. Sam had no advanced tech, no high-powered weapons. He was fighting with what he had, making do with the tools at hand. In many ways, it was so different from the way her people fought. They relied on perfection, on being superior in every way. But Sam was right, it wasn't always about perfection. It was about adaptation. About finding ways to keep going, even when everything was stacked against you. She took the scrap metal from her lap and began to work, her hands moving with an unfamiliar ease. There was a simplicity in it, a kind of clarity. She could work with this. You know, Sam said after a long silence, his voice low and thoughtful, this whole thing started because they underestimated us. They thought they could crush us in one big sweep. But what they didn't understand is that you can't crush a people who refuse to give up. That's where we win. Lyra paused mid-movement, her mind racing. Give up. The words haunted her, but not in the way they once had. She had seen entire armies crushed under the weight of defeat, their soldiers giving up, surrendering to the inevitable. But Sam wasn't talking about giving up. He was talking about surviving. Not just physically, but mentally. Spiritually. The humans she had dismissed as weak, as unworthy of her time or attention, were proving to her that there was more to them than she had realized. I've seen it before, Sam continued, glancing up at her. People who are just trying to survive. And when they do, when they really do, they'll do anything. They'll find a way. That's the thing with humanity. We never stop fighting. Lyra found herself listening more intently than she cared to admit. Her thoughts were tangled in contradictions. On one hand, she was still the commander of the Kithari forces, a warrior bred for war, a being of strength and precision. But on the other, she was beginning to see something new, something she had never fully understood before, resilience, determination, and an unwavering will to survive. She glanced up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time with something other than suspicion. And you think we can survive together? You, a human, and me, a Kithari. Sam's face softened just slightly, though his eyes still held that spark of something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. I think that, if we have to, we'll find a way. Together. Lyra looked down at the reinforced metal she had just finished securing in place. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. But it would hold. It was enough for now. And maybe, just maybe, that was all they needed. The next few hours passed in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Sam continued his repairs, and Lyra assisted where she could, learning more about his methods as they worked side by side. The feeling of being part of something, something that wasn't her people, something that wasn't perfect, was unsettling, but it was also strangely freeing. She wasn't in charge. She wasn't leading. She was just, existing. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to do so. By the time the last of the fortifications were in place, the tension between them had lessened, though not completely disappeared. Lyra wasn't sure how to feel about the strange sense of camaraderie that had begun to form. She wasn't sure if she could trust it. But as she looked out across the ruined landscape, the distant flashes of explosions lighting up the sky, one thing became clear: the war wasn't over. And no matter who she fought alongside, or against, one thing would remain the same: her will to survive. And perhaps that, too, was something Sam Carter and humanity shared with her more than she had ever realized. The night was unnervingly quiet. The distant echoes of battle had faded into the background, leaving only the sounds of the wind howling across the jagged cliffs and the occasional whirring of damaged equipment in the maintenance bay. Lyra lay against the wall, her combat suit now partially repaired, though still far from being fully functional. The dim lights above flickered sporadically, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the room. Sam sat across from her, tinkering with the remnants of a broken turret. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that their situation was precarious. Neither of them spoke, but the weight of the moment hung heavy. She was used to the battlefield, to the constant hum of chaos, the strategic movements, the rush of adrenaline that came with commanding troops in the heat of war. But this was different. Her mind wandered back to the earlier conversation. Sam's words still echoed in her mind: "We'll find a way. Together." She had heard similar things countless times in her life, but never from someone who was supposed to be her enemy. Never from a human. It was absurd, really. The whole idea was absurd. She had been trained to see humanity as nothing more than a nuisance, a threat to the Kithari people. They were weak, primitive, disorganized. But now, as she sat here in this makeshift shelter, surrounded by the remnants of a war she had started, she wasn't so sure anymore. The desperation in the eyes of the humans she had fought, especially Sam, was different. There was a fire there, a drive that she hadn't expected. The silence stretched between them, a strange companion in the aftermath of their earlier exchange. Sam had been quiet since their last conversation, absorbed in his work, yet Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Her mind churned with thoughts, conflicting ideas of loyalty, survival, and what it meant to be truly alive. She had always thought of herself as a warrior, someone who understood the rules of battle. But this was something else. She was beginning to question everything she had been taught. Finally, Sam broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "I've been thinking," he said, not looking up from the turret he was working on. "We need a plan. We can't just sit here and wait for the Kithari to come after us. We need to hit them back." Lyra sat up straighter, her interest piqued. "You want to fight them?" Her voice was laced with disbelief. "After everything that's happened, after all that we've done, you still want to fight?" Sam's eyes flicked to her for a brief moment before he turned back to his work. "Yeah, I do. Because if we don't, we're as good as dead. The Kithari won't stop. They'll keep hunting us down until there's nothing left. If we're going to survive, we need to take the fight to them." Lyra studied him, her gaze sharp. She had fought battles before, led armies into conflict. But this? This felt different. She had never been on the receiving end of such a challenge. Never been forced to question the very core of her beliefs. "And what do you suggest?" she asked, her voice more controlled now, though there was an edge of wariness to it. Sam leaned back, wiping his hands on his pants. "We hit their supply lines. They're overextended, spread too thin. If we can disrupt their reinforcements, if we can slow them down, maybe we'll have a chance. You said your people were all about strategy, right? I'm betting they didn't plan for a guerrilla war." Lyra frowned. Guerrilla tactics. It wasn't something the Kithari were accustomed to. They relied on precision strikes, overwhelming force, and flawless coordination. But Sam was right. Their forces were stretched thin, their resources depleted after months of relentless fighting. They hadn't expected a human resistance to last this long. If they were smart enough, if they had the right information, they could turn the tide. It was a risk, a big one. But it was a risk worth considering. "What do you need from me?" Lyra asked, her voice steady now, betraying none of the uncertainty she felt. She wasn't sure if she was more surprised by her willingness to entertain the idea, or by the fact that she was trusting a human, the very same species she had been sent to annihilate. Sam gave her a quick, almost mischievous smile. "A little bit of everything. I need you to help me gather intel, coordinate the strike, and maybe, just maybe, you can teach me how to fight like the Kithari. You've got the skills, I've got the tenacity. Together, we can make it work." Lyra stared at him for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling over her like a dark cloud. This was insane. She had been trained to destroy humanity, to wipe them from the face of the galaxy. But now, she was being asked to fight alongside them. The thought of it was almost too much to bear. And yet, as she looked at Sam, the faint glimmer of a plan began to form in her mind. A plan that wasn't about war or destruction, but about survival. Maybe it was time to put everything she had known to the test. Maybe it was time to stop fighting for victory and start fighting for something more. "All right," she said, her voice low and steady. "Let's do it. But we do this my way. No half measures." Sam raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Your way?" "Yes," Lyra replied, standing up and moving toward him. "We do it clean. We hit hard. We don't waste time. And when the Kithari come for us, we're ready." Sam smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Sounds like a plan. They didn't waste any more time on words. Within moments, they were gathering supplies, preparing for the strike. There was no time to second-guess, no time to wonder if they were making the right choice. They had a job to do. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra had something to fight for. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for a chance to prove that, no matter what, humanity and the Kithari could stand side by side and survive together. She didn't know how it would end, but for the first time in a long while, she felt that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. And that was more than she had hoped for. The early morning light crept in through the jagged cracks in the makeshift shelter. Lyra squinted as the first rays of the sun pierced the dimness of the room. The air smelled of metal and burnt ozone, remnants of a night spent patching up equipment and plotting their next move. She had spent hours in silence, her thoughts a tangled mess, but now, with the quiet light of dawn filling the room, a strange sense of determination had settled in her chest. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was about fighting for something bigger. She had seen it in Sam's eyes, felt it in the urgency of his voice. This wasn't just about a few isolated skirmishes. They were going to change the course of the war. Together. Sam was already awake, seated on the floor, studying the maps they had salvaged from the wreckage of an old communication station. He had been up for hours, planning their first move. Lyra admired his tenacity, but she also felt a sense of unease. It was one thing to talk about striking the Kithari where it hurt. It was another to actually do it. The Kithari were formidable, and she knew them better than anyone. They weren't just a military force, they were a culture built around the idea of perfection. They didn't lose. Not like this. We're going to need to move fast, Sam said, glancing up from the map. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a sharpness that came from knowing how dangerous the situation was. Lyra nodded, her silver eyes focused on the map spread before them. The human resistance had already sabotaged several supply lines, but they hadn't made any significant dent in the Kithari's ability to wage war. That was about to change. The plan Sam had proposed was risky, even by her standards. They would infiltrate a Kithari supply hub, cripple their communication systems, and steal enough resources to make the Kithari think twice about their next move. It was a perfect plan, if everything went according to plan. She didn't speak for a long time, her fingers tracing the lines of the map. Finally, she exhaled, her voice steady. We need to gather more intel. We can't go in blind. Sam looked at her, his brow furrowing. We don't have time for that. We've already waited too long. The Kithari will be onto us the moment we don't act. I know, Lyra replied, her tone sharp. But if we make a mistake now, it's over. We need to know exactly where their reinforcements are coming from. We can't let them call for backup. Sam sighed but didn't argue. He knew she was right. All right. But we're running out of time. We can't afford to sit here much longer. Lyra stood, her body still stiff from the wounds she had sustained during their escape. She moved toward the makeshift workbench where Sam had been repairing her suit, her mind already racing through the next steps. She had to be ready. This mission, this fight, it was going to test everything she had ever known. And she had to be at her best. You're right, she said quietly, more to herself than to Sam. We can't waste time. Let's go. The two of them gathered what little gear they had managed to salvage in the days after the ambush. Sam had managed to piece together a rudimentary set of weapons from the wreckage of Kithari tech, and Lyra's suit, though damaged, still provided enough protection to make a difference. It wasn't ideal, but it was all they had. The air outside was cold and biting, the wind carrying the scent of burning wreckage from the ongoing conflict. The hills surrounding their hideout were alive with the sounds of distant gunfire and the occasional rumble of Kithari war machines. Lyra's instincts were on high alert, her senses honed to every rustle in the wind, every crackle of the distant radio chatter. The Kithari were everywhere, and they would be looking for them. Sam led the way, his movements quick and efficient. Lyra followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of danger. They were both used to operating in hostile environments, but this was different. They were no longer enemies facing off in a war. They were now allies, working toward a common goal. And that thought was still as strange to her as it was unsettling. "We'll have to move through the canyon," Sam said, his voice low. "It's the quickest way to get to the supply hub without being spotted. But it's risky. The Kithari are using that route to move troops, and they'll be looking for any signs of resistance." Lyra nodded, her jaw tightening. "Then we make sure they don't see us." The canyon ahead stretched out before them, a deep, narrow passage carved into the earth by centuries of erosion. It was their best shot at sneaking past the Kithari patrols, but it also posed a deadly risk. If they were caught, there would be no escape. They moved quickly, staying low and keeping to the shadows. Sam had been right, Kithari patrols were everywhere, their heavily armored figures moving like shadows, scanning the environment with unnerving precision. Lyra's heart beat in her throat as they made their way deeper into the canyon, each step bringing them closer to their target, and to the point of no return. The silence between them was thick with tension. Sam didn't speak as they made their way through the canyon, but Lyra could sense the weight of his thoughts. They both knew that failure wasn't an option. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. They reached the mouth of the canyon without incident, but as they emerged into the open terrain beyond, Lyra's sharp eyes caught a movement in the distance. She raised her hand, signaling for Sam to stop. For a moment, they both stood perfectly still, watching the horizon. In the distance, a Kithari dropship hovered low to the ground, its engines humming softly as it unloaded more soldiers into the area. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. If they didn't move quickly, they'd be discovered before they even had a chance to strike. "We've got to go now," Lyra whispered, her voice urgent. Without waiting for a response, she broke into a sprint, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. Sam followed closely behind, his own movements quick and decisive. They had no choice but to run straight for the supply hub now. The Kithari were already on the move, and if they were going to hit them, they had to do it fast. The wind howled around them as they sprinted across the open ground, their target only a few kilometers away. Lyra's mind raced. Everything was coming to a head. The Kithari would soon realize something was wrong. Their strike had to be swift, precise, and overwhelming. If they didn't hit hard, if they didn't catch the Kithari off guard, they might not survive this mission. But Lyra was no stranger to risks. She had faced death countless times. And now, for the first time in a long while, she felt something else coursing through her, the promise of victory. The sun had barely risen, and the landscape stretched out before them in an endless, unforgiving expanse. Lyra's eyes were fixed on the horizon, her body still aching from the wounds sustained in their escape. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but there was something more now, something that stirred deep within her. It was hope. A feeling she hadn't allowed herself to embrace in a long time. They had come so far. From the moment Sam had pulled her from the battlefield, they had crossed miles of uncertainty, constantly evading the Kithari. And now, they were on the brink of something bigger. She could feel it in the air, the promise of change. The Kithari supply hub lay just ahead, hidden within the dense forest that stretched across the flatlands. Their mission was simple: infiltrate, disable the communications array, steal any resources they could carry, and then disappear before the Kithari could react. It sounded easy enough on paper, but Lyra knew better than to underestimate the enemy. She had fought them for years, seen the devastation they could bring. Sam had been adamant about striking now, and she couldn't disagree. The longer they waited, the more likely they were to lose the element of surprise. But she wasn't a fool. The Kithari would be watching. They would be prepared. As they neared the edge of the forest, Sam held up a hand, signaling for Lyra to stop. He knelt low, scanning the area with practiced eyes. Lyra crouched beside him, her silver gaze sweeping over the terrain. Her instincts, honed from years of battle, told her that this was the calm before the storm. It was too quiet. The Kithari wouldn't leave their supply hub unguarded, not for a second. "Something's wrong," Sam muttered under his breath, his tone tight. Lyra didn't respond immediately, instead focusing on the shadows of the trees ahead. It was almost too still. She had been in enough combat zones to know that silence was often more dangerous than noise. The Kithari had a way of making you believe you were safe, only to strike when you least expected it. Her fingers curled around the hilt of her plasma blade, the familiar weight grounding her in the present. She needed to stay sharp. They both did. "Are you sure they're there?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. "I'm sure," Sam replied, his eyes narrowing. "The signal's active. We just have to make it inside, then we can disable their systems." Lyra nodded. She had been to dozens of Kithari outposts before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the trees cast eerie shadows over the ground, or the strange hum in the air, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking right into a trap. Sam stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and Lyra followed. They moved like shadows, weaving between trees and avoiding any open ground. Every step was calculated, each one bringing them closer to the heart of the Kithari base. The forest grew denser, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying foliage. Lyra felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as they neared the outer perimeter. "Stay close," Sam whispered, his eyes scanning the area ahead. Lyra's muscles tensed as they crossed into a small clearing. Just ahead, the Kithari outpost loomed, a collection of sleek, metallic structures half buried under camouflage netting. It looked deceptively quiet, the hum of machinery almost drowned out by the natural sounds of the forest. But Lyra knew better. The Kithari were masters at hiding in plain sight. They crouched low, moving toward the edge of the camp. The supply hub wasn't far now. Lyra's hand reached for a small device in her pocket, a signal jammer. She activated it, sending a pulse through the air to temporarily scramble the Kithari's sensors. For a few precious moments, they would be invisible to their tech. It was a small window, but it was all they needed. "Go," Lyra murmured, her voice filled with quiet determination. Sam didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, darting from cover to cover, staying low to the ground. The Kithari soldiers were positioned on the outer perimeter, patrolling in tight formation, their attention focused on the terrain ahead. They hadn't noticed Sam and Lyra yet. As they neared the central building, a low, mechanical growl echoed through the trees. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes snapped up just in time to see a massive Kithari war machine, a hulking mechanical beast, easily the size of a small building, emerge from behind the trees. Its massive feet crushed the earth beneath it, sending tremors through the ground. The machine's weapons hummed with energy as it scanned the area, its massive searchlights cutting through the shadows like search beams. The air suddenly felt thick with danger. "Stay down," Sam hissed, pulling Lyra to the ground behind a large boulder. They lay there, still as statues, watching the war machine slowly move past them. The beast was patrolling the perimeter, and if they didn't move quickly, it would be impossible to get through. Lyra's pulse raced. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her, one wrong move, and they'd be caught. She had faced worse odds before, but this was different. The Kithari were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to crush the human resistance. The war machine rumbled past them, its massive form casting a shadow over their hiding spot. Lyra held her breath, waiting for the sound of its heavy footsteps to fade. As it moved further away, Sam gave her a quick nod. "Now," he said. They darted forward, moving with the speed and precision of predators in the wild. The Kithari base was just ahead, the communications tower now within sight. The window was closing fast. Lyra's mind raced through the plan: disable the tower, take what they could, and get out before the Kithari realized what had happened. They reached the base without further incident, slipping past the remaining guards. Lyra's hand was steady as she planted the explosives at the base of the tower. Sam worked quickly beside her, his fingers moving with practiced ease as he hacked into the Kithari's internal systems. "We've got 5 minutes," Sam said, his voice low. Lyra didn't respond, her focus solely on the task at hand. She felt the weight of every second ticking away, the pressure mounting. They couldn't afford a mistake. The hum of the Kithari communications network reverberated around her, and for the first time since the battle began, she allowed herself to imagine the possibilities. If they succeeded, if they took this tower down, they would have a chance. The Kithari would be blind. The resistance would finally have an opening. The countdown began, and with it, the fear that they might not make it out alive. Lyra held her breath. One last push. Then, she heard it. The whine of a Kithari fighter jet overhead. Their time was up. The shrill whine of the Kithari fighter jet echoed through the trees, slicing through the heavy silence of the forest. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, her instincts screaming at her to move, to get out, now. The Kithari had found them. Move, now. Sam's voice was sharp and urgent, pulling her from her momentary paralysis. He grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the shadows, but it was already too late. The hum of the fighter's engines grew louder, and a barrage of plasma fire cut through the air, searing the trees around them. "Damn it," Lyra hissed, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. The fighter was circling above, searching for any sign of movement. They had no time. If the Kithari knew their location, the outpost would be swarming with soldiers within minutes. They had to finish the mission, now. "I've almost got it," Sam muttered under his breath, eyes fixed on the glowing interface of his makeshift terminal. His fingers danced across the controls, hacking into the Kithari's defense systems, but the fighter jet's presence was complicating matters. The signal jammer Lyra had set up earlier was barely holding, and the Kithari were likely on the verge of locking onto their location. Lyra's mind raced. They couldn't let the fighter destroy the communications tower before they had a chance to disable it. The whole mission depended on this one moment. Her silver eyes flashed as she surveyed the terrain, noting the scattered debris and the thick, dense trees that surrounded them. There had to be something they could use. Without thinking, she bolted toward a large pile of scrap metal, hiding behind it just as another round of plasma fire raked across the clearing. The heat of the blast singed her combat suit, and she gritted her teeth against the pain, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. "Sam," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You've got to move faster." Sam's eyes were locked on the terminal, sweat trickling down his brow as he worked furiously. "Almost there," he called back. "Just need a few more seconds." Lyra didn't wait. Her hand instinctively reached for the plasma rifle slung over her shoulder, her fingers wrapping around the cold, smooth grip. She knew what she had to do. The Kithari fighter was too close, too dangerous for them to remain in the open. Without another thought, she sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, using the cover of the trees to mask her movements. The fighter was directly overhead now, its thrusters roaring as it made another pass. It was moving too fast, its weapons primed, ready to rain destruction down on them. Lyra's eyes locked on the jet, calculating. She had only one shot. Drawing a breath, she raised her rifle, aiming at the incoming fighter. Time seemed to slow as she tracked its movements. The fighter banked to the left, its guns warming up for another strike. Lyra's finger tensed on the trigger, her whole body coiled like a spring. In that instant, she let it go. A burst of plasma tore from her rifle, striking the fighter's engine pod with a resounding explosion. The jet screeched, faltering in the air for a moment as the pilot struggled to regain control. Then, with a final, deafening roar, it spiraled out of the sky, crashing into the treetops in a fiery explosion. Lyra watched as the wreckage tumbled to the earth, a plume of smoke rising into the sky. Her breath caught in her throat, but there was no time to savor the victory. They hadn't won yet. Lyra. Sam's voice cut through the ringing in her ears. She spun around to see him sprinting toward her, his expression tight with urgency. The tower's almost disabled. But we've got incoming. Lyra didn't need to be told twice. The distant sound of boots crunching on the forest floor told her all she needed to know. The Kithari were closing in, and they would be here any second. Get to the tower. Lyra shouted as she turned to run. I'll hold them off. Sam hesitated for a split second, but when he saw the resolve in her eyes, he nodded. Hurry up and don't get yourself killed, he shot back. The two of them moved in tandem, darting through the underbrush, hearts pounding in their chests. The Kithari soldiers would be on them any moment, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Lyra's senses were on high alert as they reached the base of the communications tower. The blast charges were set, and the signal jammer was still working, but she had to be sure. As they reached the tower, Lyra's fingers worked quickly, placing the final charges in place. Sam stood watch, his rifle scanning the perimeter as he kept his eyes peeled for any sign of movement. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Every distant footstep, every rustling of leaves, made Lyra's pulse race faster. She glanced over her shoulder, knowing the Kithari soldiers wouldn't be far behind. The tower hummed with energy, its powerful signals broadcasting across the region, and it was their only way to break the Kithari's hold on this world. If they couldn't take it down, they would never stand a chance. Her hand hovered over the detonator. Then, she heard it, a snap of branches from behind. Lyra spun around, just in time to see a pair of Kithari soldiers emerge from the shadows, their plasma rifles trained on them. Without hesitation, Lyra threw herself to the side, drawing her own rifle as she fired back. The forest erupted in chaos as the soldiers returned fire. Lyra's heart hammered in her chest, but her focus was unwavering. She needed to buy Sam enough time to finish the job. Get down! Sam yelled, diving behind a nearby tree as Lyra laid down suppressive fire. Plasma bolts exploded around them, scorching the bark and sending splinters flying. The air was thick with tension, each passing second feeling like a lifetime. The Kithari soldiers were closing in, their weapons crackling with energy. Lyra could hear their growls and commands through the chaos, their voices distorted by the trees and the growing noise of the fight. Come on, Sam muttered, his eyes fixed on the terminal as he frantically typed commands into the system. Lyra gritted her teeth, her weapon steady in her hands. Every shot counted. Every move had to be perfect. As the Kithari closed in, she realized something. She had come so far, fought so hard, and now, for the first time, the mission felt like it was in their hands. The seconds passed. The detonator was in her grasp. With a sharp breath, Lyra pushed the button. The explosion rattled the ground beneath her feet, a deafening boom that sent shockwaves through the forest. The Kithari base behind them erupted in flames, the tower collapsing in on itself, taking their communications and resources with it. And just like that, the first victory in their war had been won.